Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Cash Flow Positive. Today, I have brought in a special guest. I brought in an attorney. And guess what? We typically think attorneys are pretty boring. She is not boring. She's really fun and exciting, but there's a really important lesson. I kind of talked about it in the part one, but making sure your STR is truly legal. And we're going to talk a lot about deed restrictions and some other restrictions that might pop up with STRs and purchasing, but some situations that are going down now that I don't want you to fall into. And so I brought in one of the best real estate attorneys that I personally know, Katie Johnson. She's based out of Michigan. I've heard her speak at conferences. This lady knows what she's talking about. So I had to bring her on the show to talk specifically about this and give us really good advice. So without further ado, Katie, tell us more about yourself.
Hey, Kenny, thanks for having me on your podcast. So I'm a real estate attorney based in Michigan, and I'm also an investor. So I do real estate and business law, a lot of contract review, that sort of thing. And I help investors navigate regulation, deed restrictions, contracts, all that here in Michigan.
Gotcha. Do you cover other states as well?
I'm also licensed in Illinois, and I'm soon to be licensed in Indiana as well.
Gotcha. Okay. So if, just out of curiosity, and we'll talk about this at the end, but I'm just curious for our listeners. So if somebody has a legal issue in another state, do you have people you can refer them to?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a big network. I went to Michigan Law School, so I have a lot of friends in all sorts of different states doing all sorts of different kinds of law. So I absolutely can help people find the right kind of lawyer, because I think that's important when you're looking for a lawyer. And I think it can be overwhelming to someone who's not as familiar with law, because there's a lot of different kinds of law.
Yes, there are. Okay. So let's go ahead and dive into the topic today about, so I put like some catchy title at the top, like, is your STR truly legal? The problem I've been seeing, and I've mentioned it on an earlier episode, and you talked about it at a conference, are some deed restriction issues going on. There's a lot to dive into, a lot to unpack. And I think it's crazy. I don't know, Katie, like, have you ever heard a word or a phrase or a topic or something like slightly new to you or foreign to you, and you're like, oh, that's cool and interesting, and learn something. And then you start hearing it pop up every now and then, and you're like, wait a second, like I feel like I just learned this, and all of a sudden here it is again and again and again.
All over the place. Yeah.
Yeah. I recently we were dealing with a deed restriction issue in Texas, and I was just like, a week and a half ago, we were at that Michigan conference, and you were talking about deed restrictions, and everybody was having these issues, and I'm like, here it is in Texas, and it shows up in another state, and I'm like hearing about it in all these other areas, and it's just, I don't know what that is or what that's called, but the universe. So,
okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about, obviously we're not going to talk about Texas, but your experience in Michigan. And let's just start from the beginning, because I think this is, people in other states, they need to know this. It's really, really important. So let's talk about what deed restrictions are. So can you start there?
Sure. Yeah. So deed restrictions are restrictions that are placed on your property in the deed itself. So they're different from HOA. Like, a lot of people get confused and think they're like in a homeowners association or some sort of document that's totally apart from an HOA. You could have an HOA and a deed restriction. You could have both. So they're placed in when the property is being developed by the developer to restrict the use of the property. They can be in residential areas. You can have deed restrictions, and also commercial. So like in a commercial deed restriction, you might have a place where they want to restrict competitors. So it's like only one coffee shop or only one grocery store allowed in this commercial complex type deed restriction. So it could be like that. And then in the residential context, they can be all sorts of things. But the one that comes up in our short-term rental world a lot is for single family residential use only. And so this is, state by state can vary what the interpretation of what single family residential use only means. But certainly in Michigan, there's been lots of cases that say that would forbid Airbnb or short-term rentals, anything under 28 days.
Gotcha. So I heard that didn't Michigan, it was like a case or something like that where they had defined that short-term rentals were considered commercial, right? Or what was yeah.
Yeah. In the context of deed restrictions, yes, they've been defined as a commercial use. This has come up a few times now where neighbor has sued someone who has a short-term rental. They have deed restrictions on the property, and they have been ordered to stop using the property for that purpose.
Gotcha. Okay. Now, how do you, like I said, there's a lot of stuff to dive into. I'll probably go in deep on one angle and then come back out and hit something else from another angle, because there's just a lot here. And I think it's important that folks kind of plan, because just because you're not in Michigan doesn't mean that you don't, because I was mentioning earlier, I'm seeing other states with the same kind of stuff. It's pretty common. So how do deed restrictions even come about? Like, when are they implemented typically?
When the property is being developed, so like a long time ago, potentially, if you're like, depending on how old the property is. So, subdivisions, even if they don't have an HOA, that's probably going to have the higher potential to have a deed restriction in it. Places on a lake, higher potential to have a deed restriction in it. Any sort of like community where there's a bunch of houses developed, more likely to have a deed restriction, because it's, protecting the neighbors in some capacity. So that's usually when they would come up, but they could be added later, I suppose, if people wanted to do that.
Sure. And I assume they, I don't know what the legal term, so bear with me on this. They proceed or take precedence over maybe any sort of maybe county or city allowances,
Yeah, so they're totally separate from, like, if, let's say, the city or the county or the state or whatever allows short-term rentals, totally separate thing. The only difference is the county or the state is not going to be suing you to enforce these deed restrictions. The person who would have to take action against you would be someone who, like your neighbor, who also has them to sue to enforce them. It could be a group of neighbors, could be one neighbor. And we've seen that happening in Michigan, where neighbors are actually taking legal action against their neighbors.
Does it have to be someone like next door to you or in your neighborhood? Could it be somebody who like bumped it into you in the grocery store in your community that didn't like you and was like, "Hey, I know you're a short-term rental operator"? Like,
yeah, I would think it'd have to be someone in your community, or who has standing. That's a legal term, but you have to have standing to bring a lawsuit, a reason to bring it. So I wouldn't think a random stranger would be able to sue you to enforce deed restrictions. You'd have to have some sort of standing, perhaps, if they can come up with a creative legal argument to create that standing. But mostly, it's going to be limited to your neighbors.
Gotcha. Okay, that's really important. So recently, I mean, I know you're fighting some right now, some deed restriction issues like lawsuits and stuff, and you shared some examples at that Michigan conference. So, I mean, the story, we don't have to name names or whatever, because we didn't get permission to, but a lot of these stories are short-term rental operator buys a property, they don't know about the deed restrictions for whatever reason, and then they start running as a short-term rental, either then, or I've heard of both. Like, the day they start trying to run it and the neighbor finds out, or even a few years down the road, the neighbor finds out, or the neighbor's like, "Hey, I'm tired of this. What can I do to fight it?" They find out and then they sue them. How does that process work? Like, what happens during that time?
Right. So if a neighbor finds out, usually they might send you like a cease and desist letter first and say, like, "Hey, stop doing this." And then from there, yes, they would have to sue you in court and to enforce the deed restrictions. Other things we've seen is like reciprocal negative easements, meaning that just based on the character of the neighborhood, that you can't do the short-term rental. So that would have to start the process. They would have to file a lawsuit. They'd have to serve you with a lawsuit. Lawsuits are costly and take a lot of time. So for someone to do that, they'd have to be highly motivated. It's going to cost them $10,000 to $20,000. So that's something I tell my clients too, who call, like, "Hey, like, yes, you have a deed restriction." They might have me look at their information, see if they actually have a deed restriction. Yes, you have a deed restriction, but you can potentially wait it out and see what happens, see if they actually bring you to court, or you could sell, or, there's a lot of different options. There could potentially be defenses depending on how old the deed restriction is. Like you mentioned, like someone who's been doing it for years, there could be a potential defense there for waiver or stop, something like that. Just every situation is unique and different. But yes, that's typically the process.
Gotcha. How does someone find out if they even have deed restrictions on for their property?
So it's going to be in your title work. In Michigan, it'll be in your title work that you receive back from the title company. And I imagine that would be the same for other states as well. If there's any restrictions, it's going to not necessarily say it directly in your title work. So at the conference, I presented and showed what, example of title work, an example of what a deed restriction would look like. So if anyone's interested, I'm happy to send that to them. But essentially, the deed restriction would reference a different page in Lieber recorded within that county. And then you have to go look at it and see what it says. And then you look at what that recording says. It'll have a bunch of different things, potentially, maybe something about fences, whatever else. And one of them will say for single family residential use only, if you have one. And it could be, you have one, but not related to the use of your property.
Right. Okay. So with your title company, though, I've heard that you get title insurance, which is pretty normal, right? And do you advise people to get title insurance or?
Always, yes. Always get title insurance. You can also add on if you wanted different endorsements or anything like that, you can ask your title insurance, what other endorsements do you have? So in residential, at least in Michigan, it goes back 40 years. Your title company will look back 40 years. So if you want it to go back further, you could pay extra to have it go back further. Like if it's an older property, to look for more deed restrictions. But if they don't find a deed restriction and they give you title work and they say there's no deed restriction, but then one later pops up, that's when you would be covered by your title insurance. And so if people aren't familiar with title insurance, you can make claims against your title insurance. And so for one of my clients, that's what we did. We made a claim against the title insurance because it was not in the title work. And so we submitted a letter to the title insurance and said, hey, this is affecting the use of the way we're going to use the property. Please cover us. And they're covering all the legal fees associated with the lawsuit.
Gotcha. Did they have to tell the title company how they were planning on using the property when they purchased the property?
No, I don't. No, they would not have. It just what's in the title work.
Just wasn't. Okay. The deed restriction specifically.
The deed restriction was not in the title work. Yeah. Gotcha. If it had been in the title work, they wouldn't have been able to file a title claim.
Now, was it the buyer's responsibility to catch that in the deed and the title work? Or can you basically can you hire someone, or when you hire the title company to do the, check for any deed restrictions, can you have them review and say, I'm going to do this as a short-term rental. Are there any deed restrictions that would restrict me from being a short-term rental? How do you weigh that?
Yeah, I don't think a title company is going to do that for you. They, in fact, usually have you sign a waiver, hey, I've reviewed title work. Title company takes no responsibility for anything in the title work. Yeah. For example, I know someone who bought a house with a lien, but it was recorded in the title work. They just didn't read the title work. So that's your responsibility to take that title work and read it. And if you don't understand it, then I would recommend hiring a local attorney to help you. A lot of attorneys do closings for really reasonable rates, a flat rate on a residential closing. So that's an easy thing you can do before you're making this huge investment, this huge purchase.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'm always I bought my first house in New York, and they require you to use a real estate attorney. And then the further and further, I've kind of gone out. So I've gone outside of the state. I bought properties outside of the state, but I still use a real estate attorney every single time because I can't, some of the stuff they catch, and it's somebody that you have in your corner. And I mean, I'm going to be honest, title documents are not fun to read. So the one you shared, I was oh man. So I was just reading it and if you skim it, you might miss something, right?
Right. And then there's all these exceptions they throw in there to try to not allow you to have a title claim should you have a title claim in the future. And you can actually usually get them deleted or marked all satisfied before your closing. And that's something that, an attorney can help you navigate and understand which ones you can delete, which ones can be considered satisfied. Just better protects you if you ever had to make a title insurance claim.
Now, here's something interesting that you and I talked about. And I have this, I wouldn't call it an aha moment, but it felt like an aha moment, but it was kind of like a scary aha moment. So what what happens if you go under contract on a property and the title company usually doesn't engage and do title work until they feel somewhat comfortable with the financing, unless you tell them to go ahead and move forward with the title work, just in my experience. So usually they're doing the title work after the due diligence period. So what do you do if you hit a uh, deed restriction on a property past the due diligence period on a property? What can you do?
Well, there might be another out in their contract. Depends on the contract, right? Like you might have a financing contingency or some other contingency still in there. So there might be some other out. Obviously you have to look at the contract and see. But what I usually do whenever I purchase property myself or I represent someone, I request the title work like day one. Like I ask immediately, can you please send me the title work plus supporting documents so I can use my due diligence period to cancel if I need to based on title work. So that's sort of my strategy with it. You can also do a contingency based on it too, like assuming there's no issues in the title work. You could add something like that in your contract, separate and apart from your mortgage or your financing contingencies or your inspection contingencies.
I I think that's huge. I personally found that we started to just eat in the last few weeks from our conversation. So we always, for example, in the state of Kentucky, a lot of the permitting for short-term rentals is based on the county level, not the city, unless you're in like Louisville or Lexington. And so the counties, like, you have to go get a permit, but you have to go and apply at a board and go to a board meeting. They allow you to make the property contingent upon it getting a permit before you close on it. So if you don't get the permit, you can get a way out. And so we started telling people, look, because we started running into deed restrictions in Kentucky as well. Look, put it under contract, but with a contingency that it gets a permit and it can legally be an STR according, to the title work. Like, add that on there, because that's crazy. Like, I honestly, I want to check a lot of people's titles, and ask, do you know if there's a deed restriction? I don't think a lot of people would know. I don't think a lot of people would check, So it's pretty crazy. I mean, and this is it's not just Kentucky, Michigan. I think I said Texas popped up recently with a deed restriction. But I want to ask you this, because I thought this was interesting. You said this at the conference too. Is there a way to get rid of deed restriction? So what if a property is deeded as single family residence only? You can't STR it or use it for commercial activities or whatever it says, where you can't STR it. How do you, is there a way around that at all? Or is it's done, that's it?
Sometimes they expire. So sometimes the deed restrictions will be in there and they expire after a certain amount of time. They might expire from non-enforcement potentially. It's going to be state by state specific too.
Yeah.
I'll just put that out there. But so sometimes they'll expire. Otherwise, that's a good question in terms of how you might go about getting rid of them from your property, because it's if you have a deed restriction, it's going to be like a community that has deed restrictions.
Yeah.
So that question I'm going to have to look into further, like otherwise other than expiration. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure.
Is there a way to, if the seller agrees, can you remove them from the deed, or is it they're in there for good?
No, they're in. You wouldn't be able to remove it like that. No, because it's it's like a community thing. The seller doesn't have the control over removing their deed restrictions. They were recorded with the property.
Gotcha. Okay. We had that one property in Texas. I was kind of the realtor's like, yeah, there's a deed restriction. It can't be an STR. And then I was like, well, is there a way we can get rid of it? And he said that you have to get 75% of the neighborhood to agree to remove. That's just what theirs was. I'm not saying that's every single one. Like you said, state by state, area by area, but 75%, which is actually quite a bit. So you have 75%, you got to get that amount of people to even respond, if you were to send that out. And then for them to all agree, it's really hard. And so anyway, obviously that property was dead in the water, but I thought that was really interesting. And the crazy thing too is that the city, and I want to point this out to everybody, it's not just about what the city or the county say is legal. That's the deed restrictions are
Totally
individually
separate.
based.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's totally separate. And I think that's really, really important that we're doing that due diligence as well, beyond just, oh, I can legally STR in this city or town or community or county, And so, it just adds another layer of complexity. So, what are some of your other thoughts on it, Katie?
Well, I think people also conflate them with HOAs a lot, and they think a deed restriction is an HOA because they kind of have a lot of similar qualities. Like, because an HOA might say something similar, like no transient guests, residential use only, all those sort of things. And so I think that's another important distinction, that like just because it doesn't have an HOA doesn't mean it might not have a deed restriction. And I hear a lot of pushback from people too when I say for single family residential use only, that's not fair, that would prohibit short-term rentals. And while that might be the case, that's just in Michigan and other places as well. That's just how courts have interpreted short-term rentals. Because then they compare them to long-term rentals, but because you could still long-term rent even with that restriction, at least in Michigan. And so they make that comparison and they say, why aren't we like the same as long-term? But there's just been some distinctions in the courts on how short-term and long-term are viewed.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So how are you, because I mean, you're representing a lot of people in these things. Like, how are you fighting this? Or is there anything you can do to fight it?
The deed restrictions themselves, like how am I fighting it?
Yeah.
Well,
it's case by case, but I'd just like to hear some examples.
Yeah, no, I mean, in terms of one thing you can do is you can try to mediate and negotiate with the person you're working against, or like the community you're working against, and ask if they could allow you to continue your use for a certain period of time, like say 5 years, 10 years, and have it sunset. And then you would, maybe have more time to build, equity in your property, where it's like maybe not as much of a loss. Because what's the sad thing is, like, sometimes this happens like immediate. Like, you buy a house, you put a ton of money into it because you're renting it as a short-term rental, probably more money sometimes than what you could sell it for, right? And then you're kind of at this loss. So what can you do, right? So that's one way. Another way would be if anyone else on the block has been doing it or something like that for a long period of time. There could be an argument, like I mentioned before, waiver or estoppel. And then another thing would be like if the person themselves is somehow in violation as well. You could say they're operating with dirty hands. That's a defense in Michigan.
Okay. That's really interesting. Okay. Do you have any other advice or anything else to add on the deed restriction side for short-term rental operators, just in general?
No, I mean, just verify with like a local attorney, or, I would say not a realtor. I feel like they're not always even aware of deed restrictions, like even in Michigan where it's been popping up a lot. Yeah, like I want to trust what your realtor says. So I would say, like, find a trusted source, like an attorney in your area, and just verify whether deed restrictions exist. They probably do, but whether they matter in the short-term rental context, because not every state has interpreted short-term rentals as commercial use. I know Wisconsin, for example, has interpreted it, last time I checked, as a residential use. So deed restrictions are not an issue in Wisconsin. So it really depends on the state. Some states are more forgiving for short-term rentals than others.
Yeah, that's really good to know. So when it comes to, let me ask you this, because I've also heard this too, that it's like tricky. But apparently, so this is another state. So like I think it can depend. But somebody was renting out their property as an Airbnb, but it was only like part-time. Like that was their primary home. And then like maybe over the summer or when they go on vacation, they rent it out as an Airbnb. Okay, but then they sell the property and then there's still that deed restriction. But now they're saying because it won't be a primary home, boom, there's a problem. And the buyer doesn't know that. And they're assuming, well, they Airbnb'd it before, therefore it's legal. So would that be kind of applicable in Michigan if it was like a part-time Airbnb or something / the primary residence? Or is that still like you can't Airbnb it at all?
Probably. I mean, it probably would depend, I guess, on your neighbor and how upset they are, right? Like perhaps like if you're only doing it so little, like it's when you're out of town, I think
Sure.
it might not be worth it to them to try to sue you to stop you over it.
But it theoretically could, though, is what you're saying.
Theoretically, they could,
Gotcha.
but you could then probably have better arguments about like, well, really, our intended use is single family residential use.
Right.
This is such a small little thing or something like that, versus like a dedicated Airbnb where it's,
Right.
a little bit different circumstance there. So you might have some better defenses in that case. But I also think it's less likely that a neighbor would come after you if you're really only doing it a few times a year.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think the learning lessons from this, number one, is with something like this, is if you do have a deed restriction, there isn't a whole lot of workarounds if someone gets upset and tries to go after you, in my opinion, from this conversation. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. Number two, in the buying process, if you do your due diligence and check the title work on that. But at the end of the day, I mean, if you've already bought a property and you find out that it does have a deed restriction, I would just make sure, and I talk about this all the time too, just make sure you're good with your neighbors. Because that's really what it comes down to, right? Like, like if you're friends with your neighbors, then there really won't be a problem,
Yeah. And I think that goes back to like when you're purchasing or make this purchase, like even then you can go next door and tell people like, hey, this is what I plan on doing. Because then even if it, for whatever reason, slips the title or something like that, perhaps someone would know and they could tell you like, oh, hey, I think there's a deed restriction here. You can't do that. So then you can look into it and you can get a temperature on it too. Like, are people not going to like me doing this here? Because who wants to buy an investment in an area where all your neighbors hate what you're doing? So I think that could be part of your diligence too. I know some people like to be secretive about what they're going to be doing with the property and like all that, but I think in some ways that can bite you if there is something that you could have discovered by just being open and honest with your neighbors and your community on what you intend on doing.
Yeah. So beyond just deed restrictions, I mean, you're a real estate attorney. How, from your angle, how do you help buyers make sure and they're protected with the purchase and the process and things?
Well, I recommend certainly in Michigan, probably everywhere, not to purchase somewhere where there's not yet regulation. I recommend purchasing, where there's already established regulation, where there's like a certificate you get, that sort of thing. When there's not regulation, you're really just kind of going in dark, where they could potentially change the regulation, say that, there's this theory that if there's not regulation, I'll be grandfathered if they change anything, right? I think that's a lot of people's thought process on it, but then they could go back and use whatever regulation they have in place and say, well, hey, actually under that regulation, your use in a residential zone is not allowed.
Yeah.
So you're not there's no grandfathering because even if we allowed it for like 50 plus years, no grandfathering or anything like that. I'm dealing with a case like that right now on a personal property of mine as well here in Michigan.
Oh, geez.
Mhm.
Yeah, they just said no grandfather. They said no grandfathering?
Correct. Yeah. So, in my opinion, we should be right. But yeah, so they took the 1974 ordinance that was in place, said that it says residential uses are for single family use only. So they're using that and saying that therefore, Airbnbs are not allowed in residential zones, never have been. But in this case, it's a little unique too, because the township was telling people the opposite. So people would call up before all this ban went in place and ask the township about it. And the township would say, yeah, no, we don't have any regulation on it. They're allowed. We even have emails that we received as part of this lawsuit from the township that said, yeah, we have no regulation. If anything changes, you'll be grandfathered. So, but just kind of rolling the dice if you go into a town without regulation as a result.
Gotcha. That's really interesting. So, do you think they're gonna it's a lawsuit. So do you think you're gonna win, with your what are your chances on this?
I'm going to be optimistic, but they're not great. I want to be optimistic. I really do. But there's just like bad case law, bad facts in Michigan here for us. I think potentially people with more individualized estoppel claims, because estoppel is individualized. So people who have like an email like I just described may have a better chance. But our township, they're really not moving either. Like, we've tried to make offers of settlement and they just aren't interested in doing that. Because at this point there were like 250 Airbnbs in this township, and now there's like 100. So we're like, why don't you just grandfather us in? We'll drop the lawsuit. No new Airbnbs seems to solve the problem, but the township's just not interested.
Yeah, they just want to completely. Yeah, that's tough. There was a popular vacation rental market in Maine called Newry, and they didn't have any rules. And they recently just passed something that limited people's septic, the number of bedrooms based on the septic. And it's really expensive to change the septic, and there's only like 2 contractors out there who can do it. So it's like you stack all these things on top of it, and it really doesn't make sense. But there wasn't anything before, now there is, and so everyone has to drop their occupancy down.
Oh no.
Yeah, so it's like 2 plus. So you can do 2 per bedroom plus 2. Okay, so if you're a 5-bedroom, you can do 12. 6-bedroom, you can do 14. But those 5 bedrooms, a lot of them they could host 16 people because they have bunk beds, right? And anyway, so it was all based off septic and so on, and they just passed this. It wasn't there before. So, and that kills revenue. And so I that's a good point. It's a learning lesson I've seen over time is, if there's no regulation, it's just a matter of time.
Yeah, it's definitely just a matter of time. Everything's catching up, but wherever you are, it's coming. Just depends on who's in charge and that sort of thing. Yeah. And I would say here too, it's a historic vacation market. People have these cottages, and have had them for a long time. Some people so we have like a lawsuit where we banded all together, like 100 of us. And, some people have been renting for 50 plus years. And even those people have been banned, so it's kind of really unjust what's happening.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. It's really, and then, again, varies state by state, but a lot of times you're talking about like a township where, like, for example, in this township, we're talking about 7 people who control the fate of whether we can do it or not. So having those local conversations and stuff can be helpful too. In our case, it hasn't been helpful, but, just keep in mind that it's all so local and people are people, and, whatever connections you can make.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's tough whenever there's anything like that. You've got to really band together the best you can, and work as a team with the other hosts to see if you can fight it. I've seen instances where they've won, and then I'm sure you have too, and instances where they've lost. But you can't do it on your own. So yeah.
No, it's been helpful banding together because we were able to like form a nonprofit, and then we're using that nonprofit to sue, and we all contribute to that nonprofit, and that pays our legal fees and stuff like that. So instead of paying, out of pocket each, tens of thousands of dollars, we're, paying less than that to have a great legal team.
No, I love it. Cool. Well, Katie, what other ways have you personally seen in your experience where a property is beyond deed restrictions, or maybe the HOA has been talked about a little bit, but any other ways like you've seen that STR maybe wasn't legal for whatever reason?
I'm trying to think. HOA, well, the towns, obviously the regulation, we kind of talked about that. HOA deed restrictions. Sometimes people don't realize, like you're talking about in Kentucky, how you have to talk to the county. I don't think everyone realizes that sometimes it's not the town or city that controls it, but the county. And that's true here as well. I think those are the big ones, Kenny. I don't know. Do you have anything else you're thinking of?
No. I was just wondering, like, from your any stories or any cases or anything that you've seen before that might have, we've never heard of or whatever. But yeah, it's usually city or town or HOA decides to change the rules, and just different things. One that, it's tricky. There's a market in Texas, in San Antonio, and they passed so San Antonio has a weird rule. Louisville has this one too, where you cannot have an STR within a certain number of feet or
like a
it's
buffer.
right,
Yeah.
or it's a certain number of STRs per neighborhood or something like that. And
Mhm.
so the thing is you go in and you check while you're under contract, and you're like, oh, nope, you're good. And then okay, cool. I buy the property, and then you go to launch it, and they go, oh, hold on, someone applied right before, and they got the permit, and now you're in violation of whatever that rule is, and it can't be a short-term rental. It's like, yeah,
Oh no. Yeah, I
yeah,
think in that situation, if there's a buffer, like kind of like you talked about with your Kentucky situation, you would want to put a contingency on getting the permit before
hmm
closing. And in Michigan here, you can do that as well, depending on the town or township. I recently talked to a township about this, and they said, yeah, just have the new owner sign and the old owner sign the application, and then you get it licensed in advance, and then you feel really good that it's all good.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
You like that license in hand is so important. I will say, like, not every township or city will allow you to do that.
Yeah, you have to
Um,
call for sure and ask.
and I just say run at that point. It's not worth the risk. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
So
no, the financial risk. Yeah, no, for
yeah,
sure.
it's challenging. So I always encourage people to, you want to guarantee. That's why you're buying the property. Like, you don't want the risk of it being banned or limited or whatever. And because you're putting a lot of money into these things. I mean, there isn't a world right now, if you buy a short-term rental, that you can't invest into it and expect it to make you a lot of money. So you want your legal basis covered.
Yes, we definitely do, for sure.
Yeah, cool. Well, Katie, as we're kind of wrapping up here, do you have any final thoughts on the subject or anything else you want to add?
Nothing to add today. Thanks, Kenny, for having me.
Yeah, for sure. So, first off, if people have issues, maybe in Michigan or some of the states you're licensed in, or they're just looking for recommendations, how do they get in touch with you?
They can go to my website, katiejohnsonplc.com. There should be a link to schedule like a free consultation call, so they're welcome to do that. And there's also like a little box or submission form that they can fill out if they prefer to do that with their issue and all that sort of stuff. And I get back to people right away, of course.
Okay, awesome. So for those listening, it's Katie, so Katie, then Johnson, plc.com. If you want that information, you'll be on the YouTube video as well for this. I've got the website right here, and made sure it's correct. Right, Katie? That's right.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you so much.
Anyway, yeah, it's there. So if you're interested in reaching out to Katie, go check out our website, schedule some time to chat with her. Katie, as we kind of wrap up here, what is, and this we do this with every guest, what is one piece of advice, one, nugget you could give people to how to cash flow positive with their short-term rentals? Doesn't have to be about legal, it can be about anything.
Probably going to just stick to legal since we're on the topic, but yeah, I think just, hiring an attorney earlier can save you money in the long run, vetting these issues, avoiding a deal that's not going to work because of legal issues is always a good idea to check into. So that would probably be my advice. And then also, don't forget, you can call these townships. If you want to see and get answers, you can call them, ask them questions. Don't necessarily rely on what they say. You got to trust but verify. But they can be very helpful in navigating some of this stuff. Sometimes you can call and ask, like, is this in the zone I thought it was in? Because I've also seen people accidentally buy properties that they thought was in the permitted short-term rental zone. As it turns out, it was not. So just calling and verifying, like, all those different things.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. No, that's really, really helpful. I think that at the end of the day, I see a lot of people, they try to skimp on services and when they're going through the real estate transaction process. Even the teams, like, I'll see them, I can, for example, I'm not going to hire a real estate attorney because I don't need one in this state. Like they, I don't legally need one, therefore I'm not going to hire one. I can figure it out. Some people try to, these are all preferences. It's not like, oh, you have to do this, but look, especially with realtors, I see this all the time too. People are like, well, I don't need to use a realtor. And I'm like, are you buying out of state? Because why the heck would you do that if you like, okay.
You can see the house.
Yeah, I know, right? Like, you can wrap it up the cost into the, your offer. Like, anyway, so I just think that it's really important, the real estate attorney, hiring the realtor, like getting these right people who know what they're doing, they're professionals, just to protect yourself. You really expose yourself to liability and a lot of risk when you take shortcuts. And for a lot of people, it works out. I talked to I don't know, Katie, if you follow like Pace Morby and the Sub 2 gang.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I just had a phone call with a friend and client of mine who has 4 Sub 2 deals, and the bank is calling the note on 2 of them. Different banks, like because of how,
the due on sale clause. Yeah.
Yeah.
That would be a whole other podcast on that.
Well, yeah, I know. Right. Like it's a lot more complicated than they just found out. But it's just, there's a lot of risk. And when it all kind of snowballs and just collapses all at the same time, it's really catastrophic. And you just don't want to expose yourself to that. 90% of the time, 90% of the people are going to get away with it. But are you going to be in the 10% that doesn't? Like, I personally just don't want to risk that, unless it's just play money and you could throw money away like that. That's literally how I would look at it, right? Like, oh yeah, I have extra money just laying around. Like, but we don't have that, right? This is like our retirements or our kids' futures or whatever we're trying to go for. And so you got to be really careful and just smart about it. And I think at the end of the day, if there's too many red flags, you just move on, but make sure you have the right team and the right people that surrounding you to help guide you in that process to protect you. So
that's so true. And that goes to like what I'm saying about the neighbors. If there's people like, hey, we behave so quote legal, you might run into some problems there too.
Yeah. I love it. Cool. All right, Katie, thank you so much. And thank you everybody else for listening. I hope I haven't caused anyone to have a wreck while listening to this episode because you're trying to figure out if you could go check out your title and the deed and see if anything's on there. Don't stress. Remember, we talked about the whole neighbors thing. I'm not trying to scare anybody with this. I just want people to be better prepared because we are seeing a lot of cases pop up recently. And, the universe is starting to remind us in the STR space with all the regulation that's coming down the pipeline with cities and even local communities. So protect yourself, do your due diligence, and we've kind of laid out how to do that on this episode. So thank you so much, everybody, for listening, and I will see you on the next episode of Cash Flow Positive.